Trigger warning, this podcast episode features discussions of emotional and narcissistic abuse and sexual assault. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Emotional Abuse is Real. I'm your host, Sarene Leeds, and I'm so glad you're here. I can't wait to share today's episode with you. My guest is Dr. Hayley Nelson, a neuroscientist, tenured psychology professor, international speaker, and the founder of the Academy of Cognitive and Behavioral Neuroscience, where she is passionate about making neuroscience approachable. But as always, before we get into today's episode, I have a few requests. First of all, please make sure you're subscribed to this podcast on either Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. Second, please follow me on Instagram at Sarene Leeds Writes. That's SareneleedsWrites. I provided the link for you in the show notes. Another way to connect with me and this podcast is through my email list, which you can subscribe to by downloading my free resource, 10 Things I Learned from Getting Paid to Watch TV. This download is a collection of some of my best writing tips and tricks, all of which I learned from covering television. My email list is a great way to stay up to date on my latest published articles, new podcast episodes, and to connect with me if you're a business or brand owner. Did you know that in addition to my journalism work, I'm a professional writer specializing in website and email copy? Well, now you do. And if you're in the market for someone who can make your business copy sparkle, I'd love to talk to you further. The sign-up link for my free download, 10 Things I Learned from Getting Paid to Watch TV, is available in both the show notes and on my website, SareneLeedsWrites.com. Speaking of my website, are you mulling over possibly hiring me to do some fabulous copy work? Hey, that's awesome, but don't just rely on my own self-promotion. You can find several glowing client testimonials over on SareneLeedsWrites.com as well. As for the podcast, this is your friendly reminder that if you're a listener and you'd like to share your story on Emotional Abuse is Real, please don't hesitate to reach out via Instagram DM or via email at hello@SareneLeedsWrites.com. Anonymous guests are always welcome. Other ways you can support Emotional Abuse is Real include heading over to Apple Podcasts and both leaving a 5-star rating and writing a review, and by donating to our Buy Me a Coffee page. And I've linked that in the show notes. As I've said before, this is a one-woman operation, and your donations help fund the podcast's production costs. If you can, please share this podcast with anyone who might benefit from it. I truly do believe that we are building a community of survivors with emotional abuse is real, and the more awareness we raise, the easier it will be for victims to come forward. On today's episode, I chat with Dr. Hayley Nelson. I am so thrilled Dr. Hayley reached out to me because she offers up a perspective on emotional abuse that isn't discussed enough on this podcast, which is basically, where is the brain in all of this? Dr. Hayley helped me to better understand what exactly neuroscience is, and we also delved into an important area that we don't always have time to discuss on this podcast, which is how we, as emotional abuse victims, are affected by the bystanders, those who just watch us be abused without helping or offering any sort of support. So, without further ado, here's my conversation with Dr. Hayley Nelson.
My name is Dr. Hayley Nelson, and I am a neuroscientist, psychology professor, and founder of the Academy of Cognitive and Behavioral Neuroscience, where my passion is making neuroscience approachable and accessible to everybody.
Wonderful. So on that note, Dr. Nelson, what is neuroscience?
I get this question all the time. And so really neuroscience is the study of our nervous system, and the cells that make up our nervous system are known as neurons. And we study them. We study how it makes people and animals and organisms think, behave, feel things, experience things. And the real purpose of our nervous system is to allow us to interact with both the external and internal environment. So by studying that, we're able to really get a better understanding of who we are and why we do what we do and why we think the way that we think. Of course, there's many different branches within neuroscience, but I am a cognitive and behavioral neuroscientist. So I really am passionate about understanding why we do what we do, why we think what we think, and how we can change that.
Yeah, I'm so happy to hear that that neuroscience is based in the nervous system, because I've always been a giant stress ball and I'm always working to calm my nervous system. I know that that's only one layer of it, but anything we can do to better understand it, I'm all in. So how did you get involved in neuroscience?
So as a young girl, I was always really interested in biology and I was good at math and science. So it was natural for me to, when I went to college, to study that. So I was a biology major and really had my blinders on. I wanted to be pre-med and go to medical school. But then I was taking a lot of the classes. I was like, while trees and plants are fantastic, I don't really want to spend the rest of my life studying photosynthesis and things like that. And so I wasn't super passionate about my biology major. And so I took an intro to psychology class for an elective, and literally and figuratively, I feel like my mind it just exploded with excitement. I loved it. I really wanted to understand human biology and how we process information and how we make decisions and do everything that we do. Plus, understand more about mental health and all of those wonderful things. So I decided to switch to psychology. And because of that strong passion in the hard sciences as well, I just gravitated a lot more towards those biological psychology courses, pharmacology courses, things like that. And so then when I finished my bachelor's degree, I did some research with the National Institutes of Health, both with the National Institute on Mental Health as well as the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and really just found my passion on understanding more about the nervous system, using both human as well as animal models to really understand how and why we are the way that we are.
Fantastic. Wonderful. So on that note, since this is a podcast about emotional abuse, what is the connection between neuroscience and emotional abuse? How does it go hand in hand? And what is your interest in this topic?
Yeah. So I think a lot of times, because emotional abuse is not a traditionally spoken about form of abuse, right? You don't necessarily leave with bruises on your skin. And so a lot of people just think, oh, this is just what it is to be a woman, or this is just what it is to be in this field. I have to just kind of have thick skin, so to speak.
Ugh.
That a lot of times people forget that you don't have to have an acute traumatic event like a natural disaster or something physically harmful to you to actually create these changes in your brain and your body with trauma, that you can have these long-term chronic stressors, such as through emotional abuse, that can manifest itself very similarly to people who are veterans of war or rape survivors, or, where they have this one catastrophic event that happened. And then we can also see these changes with chronic long-term stressors that can actually change the shape and the function of our nervous system and can lead to maladaptive patterns, and eventually can end up leading to mental health disorders like anxiety and depression, PTSD, things like that. So I think it's really important to communicate that with people, that even though it's not something that you can necessarily see on somebody else, that if they're experiencing these chronic stressors in their life, it can lead to really, really bad things, both physiologically as well as mentally. And it's important to have that communicated so that people can make changes in their life to prevent a lot of those negative things from continuing to occur, and so that we can live happier, healthier lives.
It's so true what you said. And the reason why I grunted when you said develop a thicker skin is because that's actually one of my triggers. When I was going through my own emotional abuse, which was in the workplace, what was just as bad as the actual abuse was the lack of support. And a
Yes.
lot of that lack of support came from my fellow female colleagues because they were also in survival mode.
Yep.
And one female colleague, her constant refrain was, "You have to develop a thicker skin." And I'm just like, no,
No, I don't.
no, I
that
don't.
person needs to change. Right.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly. So yeah, I really appreciate you're saying all of those things, because sometimes I feel like I'm talking about what happened to me so much, and it happened 10 years ago, but it really is a traumatic effect that became a part of my physical makeup.
Mhm.
And so yeah, so I'm so glad that you're here and that you're talking about
Well, it's
that
really
element.
important to
Yeah.
understand. I mentioned that the nervous system is set up to allow us to interact with the external and internal environment. And one way that it does that is it really likes to automate things. It wants to flow along the path of least resistance. So the more things are repeated, whether it's, you want to train to run a marathon, you don't just wake up one day and go, run 26.2 miles. You have to work it. Right. And so the thing with the nervous system is that the more you repeat these thoughts and these behaviors, or you're hearing these things from other people, it becomes automated. And then your nervous system is set up to protect you and allow you to interact in that stressful environment, which thank God we have that, because otherwise, we have to have this fight or flight mode to protect us and to keep us safe, whether it's a saber-toothed tiger charging towards us, or it's that a-hole boss that just won't stop diminishing your quality and all the things that you have to do. So the nervous system is going to adapt to allow you to survive in those modes. And some people they like to freeze and they become very passive. Other people like to just fight back, right? And so, excuse me, we develop this pattern that protects us and keeps us safe. Well, when we're doing that, we're physically changing the structure and the connections within our brain and our nervous system, so that when we're in the grocery store, the path of least resistance is what we've been encountering all day. So that chronic stress and that putting ourselves in those situations, I shouldn't say putting ourselves in the situations, but being in those situations where we constantly have to be activated and on high alert to protect ourselves, that becomes the automatic pathway and path of least resistance for our nervous system. So we do see structural changes in the brain as a result of these chronic stressors like emotional abuse. And so these victims and these survivors of people who have gone through this situation, they are working with a system that is now almost counterintuitive to what the, other people might say, well, this is a healthy reaction. You should be responding in this sort of way. But that is no longer the path of least resistance. The path of least resistance is hiding and sheltering or fighting or whatever it is that you did to protect yourself. And so now you need to change that. And now you need to go along a path of resistance, and people find that. And that's one of the main things. It's so hard to make those changes, right? To change your thoughts, to change your behaviors, to create new habits, because you're trying to go upstream instead of flowing downstream.
Is there any new research or recommendations to therapists that would allow them to treat these specific kinds of victims better?
So I think a lot of it just has to do with that science communication piece, that a lot of times therapists and counselors, the work that they do is absolutely fantastic, but they might not have a lot of client buy-in. That people say, oh, this is just woo-woo. I'm just talking about it. I'm just complaining. I'm not making any change. But the thing is when we're trying to change our nervous system, it is not an overnight process, and you have to kind of trust in the process. And so that's why I love working with therapists and counselors, to be able to give them that neuroscience knowledge and say, hey, let's look at imaging research that says this is a brain before therapy and this is a brain after therapy. And we can actually see the connections are changing, and the outcomes and the results from your clients, the work that you're doing, is actually quite beneficial. So it gives a lot of times, I always encourage, a lot of times people who go into counseling and therapy, they might not like to understand and really study the nervous system because there's really big, scary words that we can never pronounce, right? But the thing is understanding it and hearing it from somebody who can convey it in a relatable way can now give them more tools in their tool belt so that they can communicate that science in an approachable and effective way to their clients so they have more buy-in for the techniques that they're doing. And, I've come at it from as the client myself, right? So I'm not trained in a clinical capacity, but I have been the patient, right? So, and I've gone through the process and it can be really daunting. It's like, oh, I got to talk about this again. Or you want me to do what kind of homework? You want me to talk about why does it matter what happened in my childhood? I'm talking about what happened last week with my boss. But really understanding what you're doing is you're recreating these new neural connections and this new network, and it takes time. And over time, we can actually see brain changes where areas of the brain that might be highly emotional and can lead us to doing really erratic and irrational behaviors. There's an area of the brain called the amygdala, which tends to be active in patients who've had post-traumatic stress disorder or chronic stressors in their life. That becomes the area of the brain that kind of runs the show, that guides all of our behaviors and our thoughts. But instead, we really want our prefrontal cortex to guide a lot of those mundane behaviors. So we have to retrain our brain to use that higher cognitive functioning, like executive functioning skills and patience and all of these other things that we are able to do with our prefrontal cortex, and let that run the show and to really control our thoughts and our behaviors. And that's what therapy does. It trains the brain to do that. And so sometimes people really need to see those visual cues and say, well, here's a brain. This is actually how my therapy is working. It's not a quick fix. It's not a pill that you're going to take and rewire your brain. It takes time and it takes effort for that neuroplasticity to actually change the way that we think and the way that we act on a day-to-day basis.
To me, this is just so fascinating because I've been in a lot of therapy and most of it has been really great. But this is a layer that I've never thought about because it wasn't discussed.
Right. And a lot
therapy.
of times the therapists and counselors are scared to discuss it because they feel like they're going to say something wrong or they're going to mispronounce something. And that's where that science communication, neuroscientists can be the most brilliant people on the face of the earth. But if they can't communicate their findings to an everyday person, then, it's not really that helpful. So that's really why I created my academy, to kind of be that bridge between the science and the woo-woo, so to speak.
Okay, so because I was just like, we're leading up to this. So please tell me about your academy, what it does, what your mission is, how it will ultimately help improve therapy for emotional and narcissistic abuse victims.
Yeah. So while I love working with the actual clients, I feel like I'll have a connection with those providers, the mental health providers, the counselors, the therapists, the hypnotherapists, the fitness instructors, the nutritionists, the people who work with others in a helping profession, and teach them so that they can impart that knowledge onto others. So I certify these individuals, whether they're a business coach or a mindset coach, whoever it is, if they have clients who are struggling or challenged with overcoming different obstacles in their life and they're not listening to the techniques that you're providing, well, hey, here's this way I can actually get that science background and the buy-in for them. So I created a curriculum specifically for these helping professionals. Of course, anybody can take it, but the people who usually gravitate towards it are the ones who are looking for that certification. And then they can take that knowledge in bite-sized pieces and to be able to, just as you mentioned, that with your therapy, you weren't really taught about the brain and how it can actually change and rewire itself. So giving these providers the tools necessary to help them communicate this information to their clients. And the results have shown that they actually have better outcomes because they're seeing that this is actually backed by science, that it's not woo-woo, that changing what I eat or changing how I think about things and journaling and all of those tools that the counselors might be telling you to do, there's actually scientific evidence to support it, that we can actually change the structure and function of our brain to support that.
Don't get me wrong. I love journaling and I love doing the work to help heal from these experiences, but I've never quite understood the reasoning or the background. And for me, I'm just like, all of the therapy and all the talking and all of the journaling, it's helped me to better understand everything from a big picture perspective. But there are still elements that I wasn't quite getting. So I'm so happy that you're doing this work.
Yeah, and I felt like there was a need. I was meeting with a lot of people. It actually started during the COVID pandemic, where there was this app on social media where it was audio and we were just talking, and all of these counselors and therapists and life coaches and mindset coaches were asking me questions about the brain, and because they just weren't taught it. They weren't, it just wasn't part of their training. And so I was answering the questions and I said, they kept asking me, can't you create a course about this? So that's why I started it. It was because people were actually asking me to create the course. And so then I took it one step further to actually make it a whole certification with a variety of different topics. I mean, we talk about sex, gender, and sexuality. We talk about trauma and stress. We talk about psychological disorders as well as treatment effects or treatment options for people, about habits, how we learn things, our memory. It's all included we talk about the fundamentals first and then grow up and talk about neurodevelopment and how our brains as kids are different than how they are as adults, and how it all builds upon this knowledge to have this big curriculum. Because I've been in academia as a professor for decades. So now being able to take this and just take the really relevant pieces for these helping professionals to give them those bite-sized nuggets of information that can help their clients overcome those obstacles even better.
It's really wonderful because I had a guest recently who she's a mental health professional. She's a licensed clinical social worker. And she was saying how when she was in grad school, she received no information or maybe basic information on how to help treat emotional and narcissistic abuse survivors. And she came on the podcast because she had done some recent trainings because she wanted to offer the new information that was out there. And so right now I feel like this podcast is going through a phase where I'm talking, like a great phase where I'm talking to professionals like yourself who are doing the work, offering up the correct kind of information that can only augment the treatment that victims out there are receiving.
And again, I think a lot of it is it's a hidden pandemic, so to speak, right? That we kind of experience it. And, a lot of times, as I mentioned, they'll say, get thicker skin, but they'll also say, well, that's just part of being a mom. That's just part of being a woman, but men get it as well. And, it's not okay. And it's okay to say that it's not okay, but then to be able to find the support with professionals who are trained with working with people who have undergone this. And, and to say, yes, maybe you don't have physical bruises, but the trauma and the chronic stress that you are experiencing is changing your brain in the exact same way. So this is how we can overcome that. And this is how we can rewire your brain so that you can function optimally instead of having all of these maladaptive patterns of behaviors and thoughts that are just going to make it worse and spiral to, unfortunately, it leads to a lot of mental health concerns like depression and anxiety. And we don't want that. So let's try to prevent it and open these communications. And that's why I was so happy to be a guest here today to say that there are neuroscientists out there. There are people who want this knowledge to be able to help their clients, and also the victims and the survivors who are dealing with it themselves. They can get the resources for themselves as well.
Thank you. Yeah, because when I went through my own emotional abuse, it was 10 years ago, and nobody knew what emotional abuse was. Nobody knew how to support it. I mean, I only learned that I was being emotionally abused because my therapist did tell me that was what was happening. But no one really wanted to hear me talk about it because they didn't think, well, that's why why it's called emotional abuse is real. No one thought that it was significant enough. Everyone just wanted me to get over it. So anytime I can connect with someone who says it is very real and there are resources and there are treatments available and there is more science-based evidence to help you understand it, like I said, I'm so glad. Like I said, I'm so glad that you're here. So, are you personally an emotional abuse survivor?
So I've had some abuse in my life
Mhm.
and some traumatic events. I was sexually assaulted in college, and so
I'm
dealing
sorry.
with that, and so understanding that part of my brain and how it was changed has made me become more aware
Mhm.
of all of the daily microaggressions and comments that people say. And um but through the therapy and through the work, I've been able to identify those things so that I've been able to prevent them going
Wonderful.
forward, right?
Yeah.
So I will say that yes, I people have tried to abuse me
Mhm.
emotionally. Um but having lived that experience earlier on in my life
Mhm.
has, that's one of the positive things that came from it, is that through the therapy and through the work to rewire my brain and allow me to see things in a different way and experience things differently has enabled me to have the tools to be able to cope with those abusive situations and help me figure out, okay, what's the best way to resolve this? Do I need to quit? Do I need to leave the situation? Or do I need to practice more self-care and
Mhm.
actually have things be able to bounce off of me, right? And so I'm fortunate in the fact that I haven't been in a position where I was continuously being abused
Mhm.
emotionally. However, I recognize that people try to do it, whether conscious or not, on
Right.
a daily basis. And so I think awareness is key. And then
Oh,
being
so
able to, figure out different coping mechanisms and strategies to avoid it or avoid the negative consequences of it going forward, to empower yourself to be able to recognize a situation and then be able to change it.
I love it. Yeah, I always ask uh, if a guest is a survivor because survivor stories are so crucial to this
Mhm.
podcast. So thank you for sharing that part of your story with me. And it's true because now I feel like I cannot and won't let
Yeah.
anyone try anything remotely close to what my boss did all
Right.
those years ago. I've told the story in the podcast before. At the time, I kept just a log of everything he was doing to me. Back then, I called it the bullying log
Mm.
because I didn't have the correct tools or the language. And when I read back on it now, I cannot believe that I stayed. That I
Right.
could not believe that I allowed any of this to happen because I didn't know any better.
And that's the thing. I think, unfortunately, people will try to blame the victim.
Yes.
Right. And so, well, why did you stay so long? Right. And
Mhm.
so you see that now, hindsight's 2020, that
Yes.
but you're a different person now than you were
Abs-
then. And your
yeah.
nervous system is different now than it
Yes.
was then as well. Right.
Yeah.
And so when there's those comments like, how did I let that happen for so long? Or why did you do this or do that? That's blaming the victim. Right. And
Mhm.
so I think a lot of the education has to also go towards not only the people who are doing the bullying, right? So I talk to a lot of youth as well, and people are like, oh, shouldn't we have these seminars for the bullies? Or shouldn't we have the seminars for the people who are being bullied? And I said, you know who's the most important people that we should have seminars and talk to? Are all the bystanders. The people who are hearing you talk about your situation and
Mhm.
not doing anything about it. Standing by and allowing other people to
Mhm.
continue to be bullied or to bully is not okay, right? And so, but how can we teach these people and empower these people to use the proper tools and words to be able to bring awareness so that not only can we support the victims, but also teach and educate and train the people who are the abusers to say, hey, what you're doing is not okay and you should be penalized for it. You can't continue to do this to other people.
I'm so glad you brought up the bystanders because I mentioned it earlier. And in many ways, I can deal with the memories of my abuser more.
Yeah.
I can deal with it better than I can the
Yeah.
bystanders because I, like I said, I think especially the females, I try to recognize that a lot of them were also in survival mode,
Mhm.
but what a lot of them said to me I just do not accept. And it's still really, really, it's still a really bitter pill to swallow, because trust me, there were plenty of male bystanders, but there were a lot of female bystanders too. And everyone's attitude was just, I don't want to get involved.
Mm-hmm.
It's not my problem. I've got
I
my
don't
own.
want to become the target.
Right. I don't want to become the target. I've got my own issues to deal with. And that hurt so much. So I'm
And it
so
hurts
happy.
more. It's easier to forgive the abuser, right?
Yeah.
Once you learn how to forgive other people, right? So you forgive the person who abused you, and you can forgive yourself. But that, I think, is the hardest part. I know for me with the sexual assault, through years of therapy, I was eventually able to forgive the man who raped me. But forgiving my friends and family who told me to, let's not report it. Let's, I don't want you to be a target on campus. I want to make life easier for you. Let's just call it a bad sexual experience. Let's do this, let's do that, and kind of just shove it under the rug. But I'm like, that was your opportunity to really stand up and to support me and to show others that this is not okay. And this is how we're supposed to treat women, or this is how we're supposed to treat other humans in general. And so I think that piece, a lot of times people forget about the bystanders, that, well, I'm not the one getting victimized. I'm not the one doing the abuse. So I'm not at fault here. But yes, you are. We all have voices, and we all need to protect people who might need protection every once in a while. And it's not showing that, it's not a sign of saying, oh, well, you're too weak to stand up for yourself. It's not like I would do that for my kids, obviously, because Mama Bear comes out and I want to protect my youth. But if there's a fully grown woman or man next to me who is getting abused, I can also help protect them without them being minimized and feeling that they can't do it for themselves. Sometimes we just need that example from somebody else of how to handle these situations when they're not in that victim mindset, that they, aren't in that fight or flight or freeze mode that a lot of us experience when we're in that activated sympathetic nervous system state where it's just, I need to protect myself and be in survival mode.
And just, for me, when I think back to those women, I also berate myself because I kept going back to them for support. And now I look at myself, I'm like, why do you do that? They're not going to help you. Don't bother. So that's an example of how I've definitely changed my mindset, changed my brain, but it's all of those things that are part of this experience that I'm so glad that we're talking about, because I do find that a lot of times on this podcast, we're talking about the abuser. He did this, and this is what happened. But there's the bystander. There are the bystanders, and then also just the fact that the victim is not healed enough that they keep going back thinking that the support from those people will be different.
Right. And they don't recognize where the true support is, right? Until they can heal. And that's where the therapists and counselors and pastors or coaches, whoever it is, where you can find that comfortable place where you can actually speak and share and not feel judged and actually feel supported, that then you recognize, and then you can surround yourself with those people to really feel empowered and to grow.
Yeah. So this has been incredible. I'm so glad that you've come on the podcast to share these insights. And I just want to give you an opportunity to share how the listeners can connect with you.
Absolutely. So I'm on social media as Be Well with Dr. Hayley, and that's Hayley. There's 2 Y's in my name.
Okay.
So that's on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, LinkedIn, all the big ones. I'm also on Twitter, but I'm not on there very much.
Me neither.
But the best way to contact me is through my website, which is academyofneuro.com. And there's a little chat bot at the bottom that I'll read the messages personally, and you can connect with me there. Send me an email, send me a message, and I'd love to hear from you and connect and just chat personally as well as, professionally. So I would love to hear from your listeners. Thank you so much, Sarene.
Oh, of course, of course. And I'm going to leave all the links in the show notes.
Great.
And Dr. Hayley Nelson, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. It was
You're
a
very
pleasure
welcome.
talking
Thank
to
you.
you. Thank you for listening to my conversation with Dr. Hayley Nelson on emotional abuse is real. If you would like to connect with Dr. Hayley, I've left her social media links in the show notes. If you would like to share your own emotional abuse story here on the podcast, please don't hesitate to reach out via email at hello@sereneleadsrights.com or through Instagram at sereneleadsrights. Please note that this podcast should not be used as a substitute for professional mental health services. If you are a victim of emotional abuse and need help, please call or text the Suicide and Crisis Hotline at 988 or call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. You can also text START, START, to 88788. Once again, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts. Follow me on Instagram. Go grab my free download, 10 Things I Learned from Getting Paid to Watch TV. And if you can, please support us through our Buy Me a Coffee page. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.